Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Bloor-Danforth Subway line. This was Toronto's second subway line and the first crosstown rapid transit line built in the city. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. The origins of the Bloor-Danforth Subway start in the 1940s. While there were rapid transit plans in Toronto dating back to 1909 and various routes were proposed, the 1940s is when the idea for a crosstown line truly began to gain traction. The first of these plans would come about in 1942 when the TTC proposed 2 streetcar subways for the city of Toronto. One of these lines would be a north-south line running under Yonge Street from St. Clair Avenue to Union Station and would be essentially a realignment of the Yonge streetcar. The other proposal was an east-west line under Queen Street running between Strawn and Logan. This line would be operated by the Queen and King streetcars. The city, however, was not impressed with this proposal and told the TTC to come up with a new idea. This new idea would be brought forward 3 years later in 1945. This proposal would see a rapid transit subway built under Yonge Street and a streetcar subway under Queen Street. This streetcar subway would operate underground from Trinity Bellwoods Park to Mutual Street with stops at Trinity Bellwoods Park, Bathurst, Spadina, Grange, York, City Hall, Yonge Street, and Church. From here, the line would continue east in an open-cut trench between Mutual Street and St. Paul Street with stops at Sherbourne and Parliament. East of St. Paul Street, the line would then run on an elevated structure to Bolton Avenue with stops at the Don River and Broadview. The line would then split into 2 branches from here. Ramps would be built to allow the Queen and Kingston Road streetcars access to the line from the east, with access starting at Logan Street. Another branch would continue the line alongside the CN rail tracks to Gerrard and Carlaw. Queen streetcars would operate the length of the line, while other cars such as the Dundas, Kingston Road, Bloor, and Danforth trippers would be diverted onto the line for downtown service. 2 underground turnback loops would be installed along the line, one at Church Street for westbound streetcars and one at Simcoe Street for eastbound streetcars. This proposal was put to a vote by the Toronto ratepayers and passed by a wide margin. There was, however, a condition attached to the plan that required a 20% cost subsidy from the federal government. This subsidy fell through when the federal government and the provincial governments failed to hash out a post-war employment program. This would force the city and the TTC to scale back the plan and put the Queen streetcar subway on the shelf while focus was diverted to the Yonge subway. Construction on the Yonge subway began in 1949 and a streetcar station was roughed in under Queen Station for the planned future streetcar subway under Queen Street. With the Yonge subway having opened in 1954, the city and TTC could refocus on the Queen Street line, although by this time things had changed. Streetcars had fallen out of favor as a rapid transit method, and so the line under Queen Street was to be a full subway line like that under Yonge Street. The TTC themselves also began having second thoughts about whether or not Queen Street was the right place for a crosstown subway line in this post-war world. In the rapidly changing post-war world, the idea of a crosstown line became a question of where to put it. The city of Toronto at the time favored the subway under Queen Street as it was the main east-west artery through downtown Toronto. The TTC, however, did not completely agree with this assessment. By this time, the Bloor streetcar was carrying around 9,000 passengers per hour per direction, and the PCC multiple units used on the line were at their limits. As well, car traffic along Bloor and Danforth had been gradually increasing over the years with Toronto's continued suburbanization. This was especially true in the East End as commuters from Scarborough were getting funneled onto Danforth as Queen Street didn't extend into Scarborough like it does to the west of the city through Queensway. By the mid-1950s, Latrell Loop, which was the eastern terminus of the Bloor streetcar, was connected to multiple bus lines into Scarborough. Because of these reasons, the TTC felt that Bloor and Danforth was the ideal location for the crosstown subway line. This belief, however, was controversial. The City of Toronto, alongside the towns of Long Branch, New Toronto, and Mimico, continued to back the Queen Street subway alignment. At some point, the Metropolitan Toronto Planning Board proposed what was called the Flying U proposal as a compromise plan. This proposal, from east to west, would have seen the line start at Woodbine Station along Danforth Avenue and followed the same route that exists today to Pape Station, with mid-block stations at Coxwell, Greenwood, and Donlands. However, after Pape, the line would then have turned south, likely under Carlaw or Pape possibly, and made its next stop at Strathcona Avenue. This is a bizarre choice, as Strathcona is a completely residential street. This feels like a mid-block station for the sake of it. The next stop would have been at Dundas Street, with the station being named Dagmar. The line would then continue south and then west along Queen Street to a stop named Beach. The next stop after that would have been at Broadview Avenue. The line would then continue west, crossing under the Don River, making its next stop at Sumac Street, and then another one at Sherbourne Street. The line would then connect to the Yonge Subway at Queen Station and continue west with a stop at University Avenue called Osgood. Following Osgood, the next stop would be Soho, likely at John Street, and then a stop at Spadina. The line would then continue west to Trinity Bellwoods Park and a station called Gore Vale. From here, the line would then turn north, making its next stop at Dundas Street and a stop named Bellwoods. The line would then continue north, making its next stop at College Street, with this station being named Grace. From here, the line would continue north to Bloor Street, making a stop at Christie, and then continue west to Keele Street with stops at Ossington, Dufferin, Lansdowne, Vincent, and Keele. It is worth pointing out that Vincent is what we call today Dundas West Station. The naming difference was due to there already being Dundas Station on the Yonge Subway, and the fact that under this plan there would be 4 stations along Dundas Street alone. This compromise, though, as one may expect, alienated as many people as it pleased, as now under this plan the towns of Long Branch, New Toronto, and Mimico would be robbed of the possibility of direct subway service. The TTC's plan to put the subway under Bloor and Danforth would win out in the end, however, as it had the approval of the northern suburbs as well as the City of Toronto, and so in January of 1958, Metro Council approved the plan. In September of 1958, the plan received approval from the Ontario Municipal Board, and the final approval for financial agreements was approved in April of 1959. The Bloor-Danforth Subway was to be built in 3 phases. Phase 1 would see the Yonge Subway extended up University Avenue from Union Station to St. George, where it would connect to the Bloor-Danforth Subway west of Yonge Street. It is worth noting that this means the University Extension, as it was called, was not a standalone project, but instead the first phase of the Bloor-Danforth project. Phase 2 of the project would see the Bloor-Danforth Subway itself built with 10 stations, running from St. George Station in the west to Greenwood Station in the east. Other stops would include Yorkville, Bloor-Yonge, Sherbourne, Castle Frank, Broadview, Chester, Pape, and Donlands. Phase 3 of the project, which was planned to have opened by 1969, would see the line receive 2 extensions. A 2-stop extension in the east, from Greenwood to Woodbine with a stop at Coxwell, and an 8-stop extension to the west from St. George to Keele, with stops at Walmer, Bathurst, Christie, Ossington, Dufferin, Lansdowne, and Vincent. This phased approach was adopted as the cost of construction would quickly outstrip the TTC's ability to pay for it out of the fare box revenue, and so Metro Toronto would be needed to help offset the costs to keep construction going. Eventually, aid from the provincial government would help accelerate construction of the project. The Bloor-Danforth Subway and Yonge University Subway would be physically linked together by a large double-track way between St. George, Bay, and Museum stations. The western branch of the way would pass through the upper level of St. George Station. The eastern branch of the way would pass through the lower level of Bay Station, before rising to meet the Bloor-Danforth line just west of Bloor-Yonge Station. Back when all of this was still in planning though, there was the question of whether or not the Bloor-Danforth Subway would operate as an independent service or be interlined with the Yonge University line and in essence become an eastern extension of that line. This question would be rendered moot, however, when in the early 1960s, the province pitched in an extra $60 million to see the Bloor-Danforth line built all the way to Woodbine and Kiel in one go. The way at St. George would be updated as well to now have the tracks west of St. George Station descend down to the Bloor-Danforth line east of Spadina Station. During the planning of the line, there had been some debate about some of the names for the stations. What we call Dundas West Station today was proposed to be called Vincent. This was done as a way to differentiate it from Dundas Station on the Yonge University line. The name Vincent itself comes from the now long gone street named Vincent that prior to the subway was the terminus of the King streetcar at Vincent Loop. Bay Station was to be called Yorkville, a name from the neighborhood it is in. While Bay eventually won out, the station still bears the Yorkville name as a subtitle. Lastly, there was Walmer, which is today's Spadina Station. This may suggest that at some point the design of the station was changed, as Spadina Station did not have an entrance onto Walmer Street until 2001. Construction of the line would require the expropriation of 800 properties, 70% of which were residential. The subway itself would run almost entirely north of Bloor and Danforth, with a sizable section of the eastern end of the line under Strathmore Boulevard. It is actually possible to see the alignment of the subway from above due to the chain of parking lots built on top of the tunnels. The only section of the line that actually runs directly under Bloor Street is the stretch along the Bloor Viaduct. The Bloor Viaduct itself was a big get for the TTC, as the bridge had been designed with a lower deck for rapid transit use. At the time it was believed it would be used for a streetcar subway, but in the end a normal subway would also be usable. That said, however, the subway doesn't follow the viaduct entirely. The viaduct is actually composed of two separate bridges. There is the main span that crosses the Don Valley and is the one Torontonians are familiar with. However, there is a second span that crosses the Rosedale Ravine, just east of Parliament Street. This short span also has a lower deck, however it was not used since it was incompatible with the alignment of the subway. Instead, the TTC would have to construct its own bridge over the Rosedale Ravine between Castlefrank and Sherburne Station. That said, this was still a far cheaper option than having to construct a bridge across the Don Valley. The Rosedale Ravine Bridge itself today is very nondescript on the inside and is just more tunnel if you're not aware of it. However, at one time the bridge had open skylights that let natural light in. Those, however, have since been covered over, unfortunately. The line was constructed mostly cut and cover, although there are some segments of bored tunnel. There is also a small 100-foot section of track west of Ossington that appears to be half bored. I recall this being done due to this short stretch of tunnel butting up against someone's basement, although I cannot confirm that. To dampen noise, the TTC would spray the lower portions of the tunnel walls and platforms as well as other exposed elements with asbestos fiber. A decision they would regret years later, but it was the 60s and people couldn't get enough of those sweet carcinogens at the time. The line would be served by two yards. Vincent Yard, more oftenly called Kiel Yard, which was a small yard built between Kiel and Dundas Station. This yard is pretty bare bones, being a storage yard with capacity for 8 trains. The main yard for the line, however, would be Greenwood Yard, which was constructed on an old landfill site. The yard would not only store and maintain trains for the Bloor-Danforth line, but would also be home to a large heavy maintenance center. Prior to this, trains on the Yonge line would have to be shipped by flatbed truck to the Hillcrest shops to receive the more involved maintenance procedures that couldn't be normally done at Davisville Yard. Access to the yard would be via a flying way, similar to what exists between St. George and Bay, but this time between Greenwood and Donland stations. This was done to allow trains to enter and exit service from either direction without disrupting service on the other track. While a small note, the line also included diamond crossovers at the terminus stations Woodbine and Kiel, as well as one at St. George. This is likely a holdover from the time when St. George was to be the western terminus, although no crossover was built at Greenwood Station. Lastly, there were storage tracks between Chester and Broadview and Christie and Ossington. When the Bloor-Danforth Subway opened on February 26, 1966, it brought with it the end of various streetcar lines. The Bloor streetcar was reduced to 2 shuttle services, one operating between Woodbine Station and Luttrell Loop, and the other between Keele Station and Jane Loop. The Harvard, Coxwell, and Parliament streetcars would also meet their ends with the opening of the subway. The Bathurst streetcar would be merged with the Fort streetcar, and service north of Bloor to St. Clair Avenue was abolished. This was ultimately part of the TTC streetcar abandonment policy, which foresaw the entire Toronto streetcar network replaced by buses and subways by the 1980s. Passengers transferring to the streetcar at Keele would do so via moving walkways that would ferry people to and from the subway and streetcar platforms. Over at Woodbine, access would be made through hallways at the mezzanine level. These areas still exist today, although they are now off limits to the public. For the first 6 months of its operation, the Bloor-Danforth did not operate as an independent service, but as an interline service with the Yonge University line. During this brief 6-month period in 1966, the Toronto subway would operate 3 distinct services. The first was the Yonge University Bloor line, which operated from Eglinton to Keele Station. The second was the Yonge University Danforth line, which operated from Eglinton to Woodbine Station. And lastly, there was the Bloor-Danforth line, which followed its normal route between Keele and Woodbine. To be exact, however, though, service would operate on these lines as follows. A train on the Yonge University Bloor line would depart from Eglinton and follow its route to the upper level of St. George Station. From there, the train would then merge onto the Bloor-Danforth line and travel to Keele Station. At Keele, the train would become a Bloor-Danforth train and travel east all the way to Woodbine. At Woodbine, the train would become a Yonge University Danforth train and travel back to Eglinton via Lower Bay. The same would hold true in reverse for trains going from Eglinton to Woodbine. Every second train that departed from Eglinton would follow the aforementioned route to Keele, while every first train would run to Woodbine first. This little experiment was done to see if it would actually work, simple as that. The idea being that no matter where you got on, you could ride that one train to any other part of the network without having to transfer. As you can imagine though, this idea was not without its flaws. In early March of 1966, the UCRS, the Upper Canada Railroad Society, posted an article in their newsletter pointing out that, under actual service conditions, it may result in unavoidable slowdowns at the junctions of the 2 lines. A breakdown or a delay on one route will affect the entire system. Further, high operating costs may outweigh the advantages of the direct ride to the downtown. There was also the issue of passenger confusion at stations like St. George and Bay, both of which were on multiple levels. Someone at, say, St. George Station who wanted to travel west to, say, Bathurst would be able to catch the train on both the upper and lower level from either a train coming from downtown or a train coming from Woodbine. What this would mean in practice, however, is some passengers would intentionally wait at the stairs to see which train on which level came first, leading to some serious mad dashes for the trains up and down the stairs. This type of issue could also be seen at Bay Station as well. The lines did not have dedicated platforms with the exception of the Bloor-Danforth trains due to the nature of the way used to link the lines together. It's different from what is seen at stations that have cross-platform transfers on multiple levels, like Lionel Groulx Station in Montreal or Queensboro Plaza in New York. This is achieved by twisting the lines around each other to facilitate cross-platform transfers. This, however, was not the nature of the way here in Toronto, this being because St. George was the terminus of the Yonge University line and the planned terminus of the Bloor-Danforth line briefly. Had the Yonge subway extended beyond St. George along with the Bloor-Danforth line from the start, perhaps this cross-platform arrangement could have been built. As for passengers outside of St. George and Bay stations, things were more straightforward. Passengers would be notified of the destination of the oncoming train via Rolodex displays on the platforms, as well as a chime that would sound 10 times to gain passengers' attention. These signs would display either Kiel, Woodbine, or downtown, however Eglinton was omitted. Some of these Rolodex signs can still be seen today at some stations, although they are no longer used. After 6 months of operation, the TTC would then run the two lines as separate services for a time and then put out a survey asking riders which service style they preferred. The TTC would claim that while a smaller number of people benefited from segregated service, it was all the same to the majority of riders. On the grounds of segregated lines being easier to operate, the TTC would end the interlining plan and the Bloor-Danforth and Young University lines would operate as separate lines from there on out. As a result, Lower Bay Station would be closed. The Gloucester series of rolling stock would be permanently confined to the Young University line and would never be seen on the Bloor-Danforth Subway again, save for some movement to the Greenwood Yard for maintenance until Wilson Yard opened in 1978. This, however, ended up being a good thing though, as the TTC could now operate the M1 trains on the Bloor-Danforth line faster now that the slower and heavier Gloucesters were gone. This speed up in service, however, would be gone in 1981 as trains were slowed down as a cost-cutting measure. While the original section of the Bloor-Danforth was under construction, another addition to the line had also already gotten underway. This addition would see the subway leave the city of Toronto and travel into the suburbs. This was done since by this time Metro Toronto had achieved many of its transit goals and discussions began shifting to what should be done next. The councillors from the city of Toronto went back to the old Queen Street subway plan, citing it as the next line that should be built. However, suburban councillors were also making demands, in this case for better bus service as well as the end to the fare zone system. The chairman of Metro Council at the time, Frederick Gardner, saw that in order to keep the subway boom going, it would be easier, sensible, and politically popular to extend the current existing subway lines into the suburbs than to fight over trying to build a new one from scratch. This would be helped along by the province, which gave Metro Toronto $10 million in 1965 to help this process along. This plan would see two extensions of the Bloor-Danforth line constructed, with construction starting in March of 1965 while the Bloor-Danforth itself was still under construction. One of these extensions would be in the east and see the subway extended 3 stops from Woodbine to Warden Station and into the borough of Scarborough. This extension would include new stations at Main Street and Victoria Park. With the opening of this extension, the Danforth shuttle streetcar, which operated between Woodbine Station and Latrell Loop, would be abolished. The other extension would happen in the West End and would see the line extended 6 stops from Kiel to Montgomery and into the borough of Etobicoke. This extension would include new stations at High Park, Runnymede, Jane, Old Mill, and Prince Edward. With the opening of this extension, service on the Bloor shuttle, which operated between Kiel Station and Jane Loop, would be abolished. While work on the eastern extension to Warden was going on as planned, a decision was made on the western extension to shift 2 of its proposed stations west. Prince Edward Station would be moved 5 blocks west to Royal York, and Montgomery Station would be moved 5 blocks west to Islington. This was done because both Royal York Road and Islington Avenue were far more important streets. The previous stations were meant to bookend the Kingsway shopping district, however it was felt by the TTC that a single station in the middle at Royal York would suffice for the area. The eastern extension of the line would run underground to a point just west of Victoria Park. From there, the line would run at grade to Warden Station, paralleling the CN Gecko subdivision and the abandoned Canadian Northern Railway right-of-way. Just south of Warden, a small spur was constructed. This spur was intended to be used for car deliveries from CN Rail, although it saw little use as both CN and CP Rail had better connections to the TTC at Greenwood Yard and Hillcrest respectively. Over to the west, the extension would run underground, elevated, and at grade at various points along the extension, with the main attraction being the crossing of the Humber Valley and Old Mill Station, which is half elevated above the valley and half underground. A storage track was also built east of Islington, with part of it being at grade, giving the area a unique triple portal as trains head underground to Islington Station. The opening of the extensions was met with great ceremonies, with the mayors of Scarborough and Etobicoke driving trains through paper barriers at their respective ends of the line to announce the subway had come to their boroughs. The opening of these extensions would spell the end for two streetcar lines mentioned previously, but also the Dundas streetcar would be cut back to Dundas West Station, thus ending its service to the Junction neighborhood. The TTC would make the entire subway network part of the Zone 1 fare, meaning that commuters in Scarborough and Etobicoke would have to pay a second fare when they transferred between the bus and the subway. This inclusion into the fare zone system is also why stations outside of the old city of Toronto have such large mezzanine levels. Prior to 1970s, these areas would be lined with fare gates and collectors' booths. In 1970, the fare zone system was abolished and the fare gates and collectors' booths were moved, although at Islington Station, this place remained unchanged until 1996. By the early 1970s, the cost of subway construction was starting to creep up with each year, and with the Spadina extension of the Yonge University line coming to an end, Metro Toronto decided it would extend the Bloor-Danforth Subway one last time. There would be two extensions of the line, a one-stop extension in the east from Warden to Kennedy, and a one-stop extension in the west from Islington to Kipling. This project was estimated to cost $110 million, $71.4 million of which for the Kennedy extension and $38.6 million for the Kipling extension. These extensions were touted as being the last extensions to be built in Toronto for some time. From this point on, future rapid transit construction would come in the form of cheaper alternatives such as LRT. It was for the aforementioned reason that the extensions would occur at Kennedy and Kipling stations, since these stations would be transfer points to the planned Scarborough RT and Etobicoke RT lines. The extension to Kennedy was quite expensive, coming in at $71.4 million, which is more than the $60 million needed to get the Bloor-Danforth Subway to Keele and Woodbine back in the early 60s. This wasn't helped by the fact that at the time, opposition from local residents and the many railway spurs in the area forced the TTC to put the extension underground, even though it was running in a perfectly good right-of-way. The Kipling extension was far easier and cheaper, as the TTC was able to make use of the empty space around the CP rail tracks that it follows. These extensions would open on November 22, 1980, with special ceremonies being held. At Kennedy Station, Mayor of Scarborough Gus Harris and the Ontario Minister of Community and Commercial Relations Frank Drea flipped a ceremonial switch to signal clear to the trains to depart. The same was done at Kipling Station later that day by then Mayor of Etobicoke Dennis Flynn. As of today, there have been and are plans for further extensions of the subway line. For a time, talk about further extensions was non-existent until 1989, when Premier David Peterson and the Liberals put forward his Let's Move plan. Among other things, this plan included a two-stop western extension of the subway from Kipling to Sherway Gardens Mall, with a mid-block station at East Mall. Sherway Gardens Station itself would be underground, while East Mall Station would likely be at grade. This plan, however, never went anywhere, although other proposals called for the subway to be extended to Dixie Go Station in Mississauga. Studies on this extension, however, showed that ridership would be low without a further and expensive extension to the Mississauga Civic Center. This idea would come up again in 2001 when the TTC came out with its Rapid Transit Expansion Report. In it, the TTC noted the three possible western extensions of the Bloor-Danforth Subway. The first being a 3.2 kilometer extension to Sherway Gardens with a station infilled at East Mall at a later date. The second was a further 1.4 kilometer extension from Sherway Gardens to Dixie Road in Mississauga. And finally, a further extension from there to the Mississauga Civic Center with stations at Cawthra and Cooksville. This, however, was rejected due to cost and planning complexities. This idea would come up one more time in 2008, when the TTC was asked to look at extending the Bloor-Danforth one-stop west from Kipling to East Mall with the aim to support high-density development at the closed-down Honeydale Mall. Even though much of the extension could be done at grade, the report for whatever reason examined the extension with an underground alignment and thus deemed the project to be expensive. Ultimately though, today there are no active plans for a western extension of the Bloor-Danforth Subway. Now, while all is quiet on the western front, the same cannot be said about what is going on out east. Now, I'm not going to get into the details about what has happened in Scarborough as this video is already long enough, so just know I am skipping over 10 years of information and I'm just telling you what is happening as of the making of this video. As of writing this video, in February of 2021 there is currently planning going on to extend the Bloor-Danforth Subway, now called Line 2, 3 stops from Kennedy to Shepherd Avenue with stations at Lawrence East and the Scarborough Town Centre. This extension is expected to open in 2030 and cost an estimated $5.5 billion. I think it's also interesting to point out that the extension to the Scarborough Town Centre is in fact a relatively new idea, with it coming about in around 2010. This is in comparison to, say, the extensions to Mississauga, which date back all the way to 1989. At no point between the opening of the Scarborough RT to 2010 was there ever any serious discussion of extending the subway to the Scarborough Town Centre, and any discussion of that happening before the Scarborough RT was very brief and ultimately not followed through with due to the cost of the subway extension. This is something I briefly explore in my video about the Scarborough RT line itself. The story of the Bloor-Danforth Subway is one that is still being written, and while it seems the subway will make its way to the Scarborough Town Centre, can the same be said for the western end of the line? Is Kipling the end of the line, or will the subway eventually make its way to Mississauga? With each passing year, the cost of subway construction in Toronto increases, and perhaps the time to bring the line into Mississauga has passed. The TTC noted back in 2001 that an extension to Mississauga would be expensive, and subway construction isn't getting any cheaper. That said, however, while Mississauga appears to be a pure fantasy at this point, maybe there is still potential for the line to be extended to Sherway Gardens. It does feel more like a natural terminus than Kipling does, but who knows if that will ever happen either. But all that said, and a lot has been said, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more videos like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it coming. If there's anything you want to say about the Bloor-Danforth Subway, please don't be afraid to do so down in the comments section below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.